Well, welcome back, folks, to another episode of History with Tony. We're starting a whole brand new series of presentations today. Uh, I've been asked for some time by different people if I would do something on the American Civil War, and I'll be honest, I've always been a little hesitant to do it. Not that I'm not interested, because I've always been super interested in it. I actually grew up a couple miles from a Civil War battlefield, so it's something that I've always been interested in, but I don't consider myself a very competent as far as military history. So I'm going to approach this a little bit different. We are going to be talking about the battles. Obviously, you can't do the Civil War without talking about the battles. But I'm going to concentrate more on the people than I am the actual battles themselves, because to me that's what makes this real. So, with that being said, let's kind of get started. And where we're going to start for the next few weeks is actually talking about what I call antebellum America, which is that period of time before the Civil War, because you really can't start talking about the Civil War unless you lay the groundwork, because the roots of the Civil War lay, well, as far back actually as the founding of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Um, but it definitely got started in the early 1800s after the War of 1812. You begin to see a steady march towards the Civil War. It just seemed like that we just kept stepping closer and closer to this as far as the sectionalism. So, with that being said, let's kind of get started. What can we say about the Civil War? Well, first of all, it's just amazing that something that occurred 165 years ago is still of that much interest to the American people. I did a little bit of research on this, and I wasn't surprised. I almost knew what the answer was going to be. There have been over 100,000 books written about the American Civil War. There have been more books written about that period of time than any other era in American history. And it's just really amazing that we have this much interest this far away from that event. You would think that maybe books on the World War II or maybe even Vietnam would have occurred more often, but folks, this is the greatest number of books written about any one single era in American history is the Civil War. So we have to ask ourselves why. Well, first of all, we know it was the defining moment in American history. I mean, this is the moment that defined us as a nation. Because number one, number two, it ended slavery, which was a stain upon this country, and it preserved the Union because, frankly, the Union had been trying to be ripped apart almost from the very beginning. It left a legacy that is still going on today. People still debate about what were the causes and the consequences of the Civil War. That's an argument that is just absolutely robust amongst historians, even yet today, about what actually caused the Civil War and what were the immediate consequences. We know, obviously, I think we're all aware of the lasting impact upon the social structure. uh, I mean, this is still being felt today. Uh, I can remember just a couple of years back, we were going through this whole cathartic moment in American history where we were just going through ridding ourselves of statues and anything that represented the Civil War, and particularly the Confederacy. We were just going through this cathartic situation where we were just trying to almost disappear our past. Uh, and finally, I think maybe one of the reasons it's such an interesting time and why it's held on for so long is because of the personal dimension that's involved in it. You know, if you have ancestors that lived in America in the 1800s, particularly the Civil War period, you're probably going to know stories about that impact upon those family members. I know I do. Uh, my family is just rich with stories about the Civil War. Uh, so, you know, we need to look and see. Uh, we know these changes took a heavy toll. 750,000 deaths. That's an estimate. Nobody really knows for sure. We've got a pretty good idea. It was at least over 600,000, more than World War II. But we estimate, the best historians estimate and guess, it's probably about 750,000 people died during the Civil War. That's 500 a day for 4 years. A whole generation of young men destroyed. And the wounds of that conflict, like I said, are still with us socially, politically, economically. Now, if you're interested in the Civil War and you want to do some reading, and I'm going to be doing this throughout this thing, is I'm going to be recommending books. And I'm not going to lie to you, I've not read every one of these books, but I've read quite a few of them. This is a couple of books on the Civil War. The one there on this side of the screen, The History of the Civil War by Brooks Simpson. That's a very small book. It's a very brief book. It's a very cursory outline of the Civil War. It's a good introductory book if you don't want to spend a lot of time reading. I can recommend it. I've read that book just recently. This is the big one, Battle Cry of Freedom by James McPherson. It's won the Pulitzer Prize. Most people, most historians, if you get online and look, every one of them, it's unanimous. This is the single best single volume history of the Civil War that's probably been written. I just had finished reading it for the second time. I read it many, many years ago, but I wanted to make sure and kind of reread it again to get all this in my mind really good. So it's just a really tremendous book. And if you're into reading and you want to spend time reading a pretty lengthy book, this is the best one to read. I can guarantee you. Battle Cry of Freedom by James McPherson. Just a great book. So, as I told you, I want to concentrate on the people. I want to concentrate on the lives and the people that fought in this war. And I told you that families that have lived here for very long in this country, the reason I think we're so interested, we have such a personal involvement in it. I know that's true in my family. And my family is not any different from anybody else's, but I just want to show you how it affected my family. And I imagine each one of you can tell this story in your own mind. In my case, I lived my family lived in the Ozarks, the rural Ozarks. It was still very, very remote at that time. And in the Civil War, there were 6 young Stevenson boys that lived in Christian County, Missouri, 2 brothers, Matthew Stevenson and William Mulligan Stevenson. Each had 3 boys, had other parts of the family, 2 girls, but each one of them had 3 boys. Every one of them volunteered and went to war. That's 6. One of those was my great grandfather, Jacob. He had 2 brothers that went, Daniel and Matthew, and then he had 3 cousins, James, Matthew, and William. So what happened to those 6 young boys? And again, this is where it becomes real, I think. John, my great grandfather's oldest brother, was killed in action, April 9th, 1864, at the Battle of Pleasant Hill, Louisiana. Jacob, my great grandfather, would have been in that battle with him because they were together most of the time. But he had come down with the measles, and he was actually in Tennessee in the hospital at that time. He was let out later, and then he got wounded at the Battle of Franklin, Tennessee, and he carried those wounds with him the rest of his life. He didn't die until 1921. He lived to be a fairly old man, but he was he carried those wounds. My father told me stories about him. My grandfather told me stories about his dad and the wounds that he carried with him and the suffering that he dealt with all of his life. They had a younger brother by the name of Daniel, who actually never really went to war. He was in what was called the Enrolled Missouri Militia, which was basically a home guard. And their job was to kind of protect the area around here from marauders and guerrilla warfare and all. Daniel suffered, though probably suffering, today we would call it PTSD, because after the war, he went through a very serious time of what can I say? He was just a hellion, you know. And it was obvious that, in talking to my family, that it came from the war. Ended up dying a very violent death in 1882. Won't go into it, but it was not an easy death. Let's put it that way. Now, Jacob, my great great grandfather, had three cousins. One of them was James, the son of William Mulligan, and he died on August 4th, 1864, of the measles in Tennessee, as did William. He died not too long before that, in March of 1864, in Memphis, in the hospital. The only one, the only one that made it out of the war without suffering apparently any kind of wounds or post-traumatic stress disorder or anything was Matthew, one of the cousins. He lived to 1899. Was never wounded. He had a relatively normal life. So think about this, folks. Six young boys, all living in one of the remotest parts of the United States at that time, volunteering for the war. Of those six, five suffered tremendously from the war. The one in the middle here is John. That was the one that was killed in Pleasant Hill, Louisiana. This is Daniel, the youngest boy. He was the one that suffered PTSD and would die in the 80s. That is my great great grandfather. Pardon me. Yes, my great great grandfather, Jacob. Uh, I never knew him. He died in 1921, but obviously I'm very aware of his son, Joe, my grandfather, and I've told you this story before. If you've been with me, you know this story. But it has had such an impact upon me as a young kid that I've never forgotten it. And I'm going to tell it again because, again, folks, this is how the Civil War plays such a reality, such a part upon our lives, even yet today. I can recall this just like it happened yesterday, 1961, the centennial of the Battle of Wilson's Creek. I grew up like 2.5, 3 miles from Wilson's Creek. I can remember out there playing around on the battlefield before it was a national park. I actually spent the night in the only structure that's still standing from the war, the Ray House, because one of my good friends at that point in time was renting the house, and I spent the night with him, not even really realizing where I was spending the night until later. So 1961 came around, and as you might imagine, it was a big deal in my little hometown of Republic. And everybody, I was like 13 going on 14, actually about 13 going on about 9 because I was pretty young. Uh, you know, I was still playing cowboys and Indians, and I was still playing cops and robbers and war and all this stuff like we used to play. Not today, where they get down from the video game and you punch buttons. We were out there, playing it. Well, for whatever reason, we all chose up sides. Seemed like, some of us were going to be Union, some of us were going to be rebels. And I chose to be a rebel. I have no idea why. I can't even begin to tell you what thought processes went into my thinking about that. But I decided I wanted to be a rebel. And so somewhere along the line, and I cannot tell you where or how, I obtained a Confederate flag and an old Confederate campaign hat. And I wore that thing around all summer. So proud, I had no idea what I was doing. I was just a young kid. And then I made a really critical mistake. I wore that hat and carried that flag down to my grandfather's house one day. Now, you got to understand, Grandpa Joe and I were best buds. I love that man like no other. And I think he felt the same way about me. We were extremely close. And, I would go down and visit him. He only lived like a block from me. And so I walk in that day, and he was sitting out in his front yard under a big old tree, as he did every afternoon, reading a book, smoking his pipe. And I walked up carrying that flag and wearing that hat. And I remember he raised his head, and I could almost see sparks coming out of his eyes. And I won't say exactly what he said, but he voiced in a very angry voice for me to get off his property and said, "Don't you ever come back carrying that flag, wearing that hat." Now, I had no idea. Frankly, I was just absolutely crushed. And I'm not afraid to admit it. I'm not embarrassed to admit it. I went home and lay down in my bed and cried my eyes out. Yeah. because I could not figure out for the life of me why he was so angry with me. And then my dad came. And I remember my mom, I overheard her saying, "You better go in and straighten out your son. He's been in there crying all day." And my dad was a no nonsense type guy. Came in there, he said, "What's going on?" I told him, and he really began to dress me down pretty bad. And the light came on. And he explained to me, "Tony, don't you understand that your grandpa Joe's father fought in the Civil War and carried his wounds with him for the rest of his life? He fought against that flag." And he explained the whole history of my family to me. And I was just crushed because, I had no idea. I just, I was just a kid. Uh, we made up, you know, uh, went down to the house the next day, told him I was sorry, told him I didn't understand. Everything was fine, no problem. There's my grandpa Joe sitting in his chair in the house, smoking his corncob pipe. And there's me. I have no idea when that picture was taken or who took it, but that's me with my stupid little rebel hat and my Confederate flag. And I will tell you this, I never wore that hat or carried that flag again the rest of my life. And I cannot tell you what happened to it. I've got a feeling probably my dad probably threw it out and burned it, as well he should have. So that's just my story about the Civil War. That is what brought the Civil War home to me. And I've just had a really big interest in it the rest of my life. And frankly, I'll be honest with you, I think that probably has as much to do with me becoming a history teacher as just about anything else that happened in my young life, because it just really was so real to me at that point. And I understood that we were talking about real people suffering real damage. It wasn't just something to read in the history book. It wasn't something to watch on TV. It actually happened. So, what caused the Civil War? Well, there's two big theories about that. One emphasizes the abolition of slavery, obviously, and we all know that was a big part of it. The other focuses on the preservation of the Union. Now, I told you in the beginning, there's a robust debate still going on today about the cause of the Civil War. And it's still out there, folks. People argue. I mean, all you have to do is get online and start looking at some of the uh, places out there, and you're going to see all sorts of arguments going on about what caused it. Most historians today, almost universally, go on the theory that slavery was the root cause of the Civil War, and I totally understand that. If you go back, you will see that most historians in the past, after the Civil War and into the 20s and the 30s, primarily talk more about the preservation of the Union. So, which one is it? Well, frankly, folks, it's both. And probably it's somewhere in the middle. So let's kind of explore this a little bit, okay? Because we need to talk about this. It's true that slavery was the elephant in the room, and we all know that. And it most certainly did become the primary focus after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, where he freed the slaves in the states that were still in rebellion. Didn't free all the slaves. We'll talk about that later. But it doesn't appear to have been the initial cause of the war, except in the minds of the most strident abolitionists. It appears that, at least in the beginning, particularly in the North, there was more of a concern about preservation of the Union than ending slavery. Now, why do I say that? Well, first of all you have to do is look at the words of the people that were governing this. Lincoln, as well as most other Northerners, repeatedly stated, both prior to and during the first years of the war, that the primary aim of the federal government was to end their insurrection and preserve the Union. It wasn't that they were against abolition of slavery, because most of them personally were for that. They wanted abolition of slavery, but they didn't feel like that was the thing that was really being fought. They were more concerned about preserving the Union, keeping it together. And frankly, I've just finished reading a biography of Lincoln, a very good one. I've read others before, but I read a really good one this time. And there's no doubt in my mind that he believed that the nation was not quite ready for the abolition of slavery when the war began. and let alone recognition of free blacks as equals to the white race. Now, that may shock you, what I just said there, but I'm going to, let's look at this, okay? Let's look at some of the quotes of Abraham Lincoln. This is from the Lincoln Douglas debates of 1858. Lincoln was running for the Senate in Illinois in 1858. And he and Stephen Douglas had a series of debates that have come down to us as very famous. And in it, the main primary topic was popular sovereignty, which was the idea that people in new territories ought to have the right to make the decision about slavery. This is what Lincoln said about slaves and slavery in 1858, 2 years before he became president. This is straight out of Lincoln's mouth. I am not, nor have I ever been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social political equality of the white and black races. I am not, nor have I ever been, in favor of making voters or juries of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. There is a physical difference between the white and black people, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. Now, did he change? Absolutely. He most certainly did change. He began to see what so many other people were seeing. But in the beginning, that was not the thrust of Lincoln. He was not out there campaigning and championing, equality, freedom for the slaves. Now, look what he said in April 4th, 1864. Look how he has changed. However, it appears that regardless of feelings about the equality of races, he nevertheless was anti-slavery. This is what he wrote to a guy by the name of Albert Hodges, one of his friends, in 1864. I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. And I cannot remember when I did not think so. Now, you may look at those two quotes and say, how could he change so rapidly? Well, obviously, the war had a great impact upon Lincoln. It had a great impact upon our nation. And people begin to see the wrongness that was slavery, particularly in the North. They begin to see that this was not the way things should be. People had seen that for a long time, but they really begin to concentrate on it. Now, let's go back and think about our founding fathers, okay? How in the world did slavery become so ingrained in this country? Now, we just finished a several months study of what I call the American Scripture. The documents where we, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights that govern this country. And we know, if you were with me, that there was an acceptance of slavery in both those documents. And it's a dark stain on this republic. There is no doubt about it, folks. The acceptance of it, denial of human rights to minorities, was clearly embraced by these two documents at that time. We know that most of the founding fathers were slave owners. Not all, but most of them. We know that some, not all, freed their slaves eventually. But yet they willingly perpetrated the ownership of slaves in documents that they signed as a compromise. Why did they do it? Because they wanted to establish a more perfect union in their mind. And they knew it could not be done if they went full throttle anti-slavery, because the South was not going to southern states, which was ingrained at that point with slavery, was not going to let that happen. They were not going to be part of this country if you did away with slavery. Now, it's important to know that it wasn't just Black Americans that were disenfranchised. Native Americans obviously enjoyed no rights either. Women were excluded. It's not that they were treated as slaves, but they were, I'll be honest, probably in most areas, probably a little more than that. Okay. They were treated with a certain, attitude that they had to be taken care of because they were not capable of doing anything except bearing children and cleaning house. and cooking meals. That was the attitude of probably the people of that generation. And even a lot of whites, folks, uh, were denied the very basics enfranchisement of things like rights, like property ownership, voting, legal guarantees. Uh, if you were an indentured servant, you were little more than a slave at that time. If you came from Ireland in the 1800s, you were probably treated just as poorly as many blacks were. Uh, it was not a very pretty picture, okay? So let's kind of go back again and look at our founding fathers. Who owned these slaves? Well, George Washington owned slaves. In fact, he was one of the biggest slave owners in America. He owned 600 plus slaves. Uh, he wasn't for slavery. In fact, Kate, he made a provision in his will freeing all of his slaves upon his death. You might ask yourself, why didn't he free them before that? I can't answer that. Okay. I can only surmise. Uh, he can. This is what Washington said. I can only say that there is not a man living who wishes more than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolishment of slavery. So he made provisions. On the other hand, Thomas Jefferson, who was also a huge slave owner, 600 plus, and we all know the story. We know that he fathered several children by one of his slaves, Sally Hemings. This is proved by DNA. There's no question about it in anybody's minds anymore. And yet he authored the Declaration of Independence, the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom, and yet he accepted slavery. In his mind, he said, as a necessary evil. Now, uh, he described slavery as forcing tyranny and depravity on the master and slave alike, but he did not free his slaves. He did free about 7 of them, his direct descendants, Sally Hemings and her children, and a couple more he did free out of the 600. The rest of them he did not free upon his death or during his lifetime. James Madison, who wrote the Constitution, basically, owned 100 plus slaves, and he did not free his slaves upon his death. Benjamin Franklin owned a very small number of slaves early in his life, and then he did change and free the slaves that he owned. Patrick Henry owned slaves. The give me liberty, give me death guy. John Jay, the first Supreme Court justice, owned slaves. There were founding fathers of note that did not own slaves, amongst them John Adams. John Adams was anti slavery from the beginning, as was Alexander Hamilton. That probably came naturally because there is some question about the ancestry of Alexander Hamilton and whether or not he was actually part black. He may have been, we don't know that for sure, but there's a very real possibility that he could have been. Thomas Paine, who came from England and wrote Common Sense, was very much anti-slavery. So it was a mixed thing amongst the founding fathers. So, what does the Constitution say about slavery? And again, if you were with me, this is kind of rehashing this, but we need to get it in our head. Okay. The U.S. Constitution was written by revolutionary thinkers, and they had a message of inclusivity, justice, domestic tranquility. And we know that the Constitution provided for the first functioning democratic government in the world. And those ideas that are written in it, fairness, justice, individual rights, are what most governments in the world today aspire to. They want to be what America is, and a lot of them are in terms of freedom and equality. So you have to ask yourself, why in the world did all these brilliant minds who championed individual rights on one hand allow for human beings to be reduced to just mere chattel on the other? How in the world could they think that way? And it's hard for us to understand. Of course, the reason is simple, folks. It was compromise. I just told you they wanted to form a more perfect union. And they absolutely knew that if they did not allow for slavery to be legal, at least for a period of time, that there was not going to be a new nation formed. Now, most of them, and from my reading, I've been able to figure this out. Most of them felt like it was going to disappear. Most of them felt like that we were going to outgrow it. That didn't work out. Okay. By the way, if I didn't mention it when we were talking about the American scripture, I will tell you now, nowhere in the Constitution was the word slavery used. That term is never written anywhere in the Constitution, or for that matter of fact, in the Declaration of Independence. John Quincy Adams, our sixth president, and the son of John Adams, and John Quincy Adams was very much anti-slavery, often talked about this, and he said the omission of the word slavery is a fig leaf under which the parts of the body politic are decently concealed. In other words, he was being sarcastic there. He said, no, we don't talk about slavery in the Constitution, but it's there. There's a fig leaf covering it, just like there was Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. So, what's in the Constitution that talks about slavery? There are three specific areas that talks about slavery. Doesn't mention slavery, doesn't use the terms, but let's review it real fast because again, this is where the Civil War started, folks. Right here, Article 1, Section 2, the Three-Fifths Compromise. If you can go back with me in your mind, you remember we talked about this a few months back, where in order to allow for the counting of slaves in the southern states, there was a compromise reached where slaves were to be counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation in the House of Representatives. They were not to be counted as a full person. This was a compromise reached. The South wanted them counted. The North didn't want them counted at all. You see the hypocrisy there? The South, it wasn't that they were saying that they were people and that they were citizens. They just wanted them counted so they would have more representatives in the House of Representatives. The North, on the other hand, didn't want them to be counted at all. They said, why should we count them? Because they're property. It's so hypocritical. It just blows the mind. Even Alexander Hamilton, who was very much anti-slavery, recognized this, and he said no union could have been possible without the federal ratio. That's what it was called. So again, the common misconception is that this represents the amount of humanity that the framers assigned to African American. That's not what it was all about, folks. It was all about politics. Okay, it didn't have anything to do with humanity. It had to do with politics. So we know that the clause was eventually repealed by the 14th Amendment in 1868. So it was repealed. It's no longer there. So that's what the Three-Fifths Compromise is all about. This is the first of three sections of the Constitution that talks about slavery. So the second one had to do with the slave trade. Now, again, the slave trade was a big thing in the early 1800s, the late 1700s. And Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution says the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing think proper to admit, slaves, shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10. So what the Constitution originally said was, we're going to allow the slave trade up to 1808, but we're going to tax them. We're going to tax you $10 a person, But after 1808, you cannot import slaves from out of the country. Didn't talk anything about the slaves within the country. It just said we're going to forbid to bring in any more new slaves into the country. And they thought in their mind that this would eliminate slavery. They thought surely, as the slaves begin to die off and all like this, that they won't be be replaced. Obviously faulty thinking. Okay. And again, I suspect that they probably knew this. And again, on the surface, it would appear to be a clear-cut case of morality. Folks, that wasn't the case. Because look, Virginia, who had the most slaves of any state in the United States, absolutely fought hard to abolish the slave trade. Why? Because they understood that the slave trade was cutting into their profit. They had a lot of domestic slaves that they wanted to sell for money. So Virginia, the biggest slave state in America, was against the slave trade. Massachusetts, which was the hotbed of abolition even early in this country, absolutely wanted the slave trade to go on because they were profiting from it. Because a lot of the slaves came through the harbors of New England and then were shipped southward. So they absolutely, were for the slave trade economically. It just absolutely sears your thinking when you think of the hypocrisy of this whole thing. 1809, the slave trade was abolished, and as a result, this part of the Constitution was no longer in existence. I found this photo. This is the earliest known photo of a slave ship that I was able to find. This is some of the sailors bringing over slavers, bringing over some of the slaves from primarily West Africa. This is where it was. Uh, these slaves were primarily enslaved by different tribes in Africa, and then the slavers would pick them up on the coast and pay the tribe that had enslaved them money or whatever, and then they would bring them primarily to the Caribbean. They weren't initially brought that much into the United States. They were primarily brought to places like Haiti and Cuba, which were huge areas of things like tobacco and sugar plantations and stuff like this, were very labor intensive things. Okay, the third element written into the Constitution was the Fugitive Slave Clause. This was the one that really would cause a lot of problems right near the Civil War. Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3. No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered upon claim of the property to whom such service or labor be due. In other words, you could escape slavery, but if you were caught, you had to be returned. If an enslaved person crossed the state line where slavery was abolished, citizens of that state were obligated to return that slave to their owner. They had no choice. And this was upheld by the Supreme Court, 1842, the case of Prigg versus Pennsylvania. They upheld this section of the Constitution and said it was totally constitutional. Fugitive slave laws actually got worse in 1850 because part of the compromise to let California into the Union, and we're going to talk about this later, the compromise of 1850 was that the fugitive slave laws, which were being ignored quite a bit in the North, had to be tightened. And as a result, this became one of the biggest controversies in the 1850s leading up to the Civil War. And we'll talk about this when we talk about sectionalism next week. These fugitive slave laws were resisted by abolitionists and served as one of the primary igniters of the Civil War. Obviously, this was done away with by the 13th Amendment. So, none of the three sections that were originally written in the Constitution are in effect any longer, obviously. Okay. Slavery was done away with by the Civil War. 13th Amendment freed the slaves. The 14th Amendment, as we've talked about, granted them citizenship. The 15th Amendment granted them the right to vote, doing away with those sections. Here's an example. This is a poster of 1853. $100 reward. Run away from the subscriber on the 27th of July. My black woman named Emily, 17 years of age, well-grown, black color, has a whining voice. She took with her one dark calico and one blue and white dress, a red corded gingham bonnet, a white striped shawl, and slippers. I will pay the above reward if taken near the Ohio River on Kentucky, or $300 if taken in the state of Ohio and delivered to me near Lewisburg, Mason County, Kentucky. Thomas Williams, August 4th, 1853. These are out there. This was what was being done in the 1850s. So, the last thing today, What was the state of slavery by the numbers when the Civil War began? How many slaves were there? Where were they? Etc. It's important to understand that really we need to know this. How many slaves there were by 1525 and 1866? There were 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the Americans via the Middle Passage. That part of the thing that was where they primarily were shipped to the Caribbean. Of those 12.5 million, only about 10.7 survived. In other words, you could say basically a fourth didn't survive the journey. They died in vast numbers. Only about 388,000 came directly to North America. Again, this kind of surprises people. You thought most people think that the slaves came from West Africa up to Charleston or Savannah or you know Roanoke or somewhere like that, or Boston or Philadelphia. No, they went to the Caribbean islands, and from there they were basically transported into the United States. About 25% of those 12.5 million Africans were children. And again, about 12 to 13% of them did not make it. So that's what the understanding was. By 1860, America's black population had a population of about almost 4 million slaves in the United States. We know this from the census because there was a census taken in 1860. We know there was about 500,000 free blacks. This always surprises people, but there was a large number of free blacks that either were never slaves to begin with or had been, uh, freed by their owners. Census figures in 1860 showed that 75% of white families in the United States did not own a single slave. So 3/4 of the families in the United States didn't own slaves. And only 1% owned 40 or more. So again, we get it in our head that there's these big plantations just screaming with large number of slaves. And there were. Don't get me wrong, there were those that existed. But that was a very small number. Only one slave owner held as many as 1,000 enslaved people in 1860. Now, that's a lot, okay? And I don't want to minimize that number. Just 125 people had over 250 slaves in 1860. So again, most slaves that were owned in the United States at this time were owned in very small numbers by a very small number of people. Virginia had the most, close to 500,000. There were other states in the South that had a larger percentage of their population. For instance, South Carolina, 57% of the population of South Carolina were slaves. In Mississippi, it was 55%. In Louisiana, it was 47%. In Alabama, 45%. Florida and Georgia, about 44%. So some of the states in the Deep South had a larger percentage of their population as slaves, but Virginia had the most. By 1860, as I've told you, there was close to 500,000 free blacks in the United States. Most of them located in big cities, but surprisingly, folks, and this again surprises people, they weren't all in the North. In fact, there were several cities in the South that had large free black populations. St. Louis had a huge free black population. And again, it wasn't the Deep South, but it was a slave state. New Orleans probably had the most. New Orleans was a huge mecca for free blacks. And again, this had to do with the French originally owning, New Orleans and Louisiana, which were a little bit more tolerant about slavery, doing away with it than we were at that time. Boston, Philadelphia, and New York also had large numbers of free black populations. So look at the map here, okay? The states in red, 40% of the population or more were slaves. The states in orange, and I don't see any, I don't know why they have that there, but they do, okay? The states in yellow, there was 30% of the population. So Texas, North Carolina, Virginia. I had smaller percentage, but large numbers, particularly Virginia. And then the states in the brown had greater than 20%. These were the border states for the most part: Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware all had less than 20%. But again, the numbers were pretty big. If you look, Missouri had 114,000, almost 115,000 slaves at the beginning of the Civil War. So that was a pretty large number. Not as big as, say, Texas, a little bit bigger than Arkansas, which had a greater percentage of slaves. So that's where we stand as far as slavery. Now, next week, we're going to talk about the march towards the Civil War by what we call sectionalism. There began to be a division in this country between the North and the South, and several events pop up, getting us closer and closer and closer to the Civil War. So that's what we're going to be talking about next week, is these events that come about in this war. Well, I hope that you've learned something today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope that you'll be with me next week, and hopefully we can learn a little bit more about the prelude to the Civil War in the antebellum America. So that's it for today. I'll let you go, and we will see you next week.